Thank you. Well, thank you to Professor Wood, and thanks for all of you for showing up so early today. I'm Joe Kutchera, and my company is Latino Link Advisors. Little background about me. This is me and my wife at the launch of my book, Éxito, which is a 5-step process to digital marketing. This is our little burrito, our daughter, Daniela. My company is named after my first book, Latino Link, Building Brands Online with Hispanic Communities and Content. These are some of the clients I've worked with. The Valentine Museum here in Richmond, Virginia. I worked on the Hispanic PR and social media strategy for launching their exhibit, Nuestras Historias Latinos in Richmond. I worked with the BBC on relaunching a show called Top Gear in Latin America, using influencer strategy with car bloggers, luxury car bloggers in Mexico and Latin America. I worked for 3 years with a company in Silicon Valley called Flipboard. Maybe some of you know it. It's integrated onto all the Android phones across the world, or the Samsung phones rather. An importer-exporter out of Guatemala called AgroAmerica. And I'll be sharing a couple of those case studies with you. Some people ask, how does a white guy from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, end up working in the Hispanic market in Latin America? I have these two people to thank. They're my parents. And in the introduction to my book, Latino Link, you'll read, it says there in the dedication, this book is dedicated to my parents who met in Spanish class, honeymooned in Mexico, and had me 9 months later. I've loved learning to speak Spanish ever since, which is why you could say I'm made in Mexico. As Professor Wood was mentioned, I worked on launching what's now the largest business news site in Mexico called CNN Expansión, or now it's Expansión.mx. But at the time I was working at Time Warner in New York City. The company bought a Grupo Expansión in Mexico City. I was working at CNN Money, and I was the first employee brought down to kind of replicate that strategy of bringing the assets and content together of multiple magazines into one website. And we launched CNN Expansión, which now has, we brought it from 0 to about $1 million in revenue. And again, also from 0 users to what's now about 5 million users today. And Expansión is, you could compare it to essentially like Fortune magazine, which Time Inc. owns, or Forbes magazine. So what are we going to talk about today? I want to provide to all of you here in your international marketing class just an overview about what are the opportunities, what's the market size of Mexico, Brazil, and the US Hispanic markets. Then I'm going to share with you a case study of one of my clients, Flipboard. How many of you know and use Flipboard? A couple of you? Okay, well, I'll show you what that looks like. So how we develop partnerships and ad sales in Latin America. Then I want to share with you a story about working with a tropical fruit producer in Guatemala called AgroAmerica, and specifically how we developed content for them in both English and Spanish, and optimized their site in both languages for search engines. My last case study is a really interesting and surprising one, and it's the story of Amtrak's website and how they, by getting into Spanish, how they stumbled into kind of a multinational, multilingual expansion strategy. And lastly, conclusions, and after that I'll welcome your questions. And actually, we'll have to put that one on pause, but if we can maybe get access to the internet, I can show you a little bit about how we can look up different keywords. How many of you know Google Trends or the keywords tool? Okay, we can take a peek at that and look at how those specific tools actually enable businesses to look at market opportunities for what's the search volume for specific products and services in those countries. Before I jump in, any things that you guys want to learn or things that you're curious about with regards to expanding into Latin America or social media marketing?
One thing I'm curious about is how to market yourself best internationally.
As a person?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Like, what's the best way to present yourself to various businesses in different international arenas, whether it's Latin America or like Asian countries?
For job searching opportunities. Okay, great. I don't get into that in my presentation, but let's circle back and once we kind of look at everything here and we can address that. It's interesting. Obviously, social media is one thing where you can develop your own brand, and you can take a lot of the lessons here to apply that to your own personal brand. Anyone here working on projects or papers with regards to Mexico or Latin America? No? Okay. Well, save your I'll be ready for your questions at the end. So, why Latin America? English, is the kind of lingua franca of the business world, as we know, but Spanish is a top 3 language used in the world. It's third after Mandarin. There are over 500 million Spanish speakers in the world, 20 Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, from Mexico all the way south to Argentina and Chile in South America. Internet users in Latin America, about 254 million across the region. And the largest markets in Latin America are Mexico, which is obviously just south of the United States, the southernmost country in North America, and Brazil, the largest country in both geographic size and population in South America. And that's the B in BRIC, which is what was popular 5-10 years ago, but the fastest growing countries in the world: Brazil, Russia, India, China.
Joe, can you go back one
Sure.
Let me ask you clearly, what's your point in reversing the globe?
Well, geographers and maybe political scientists ask, why is Europe at the center of maps? Obviously it's historically been the center of power and economic influence for millennia, and I like this just to start with maybe a different viewpoint of, and obviously when you switch the map around, things look differently. You start to see how large Brazil is as a country in terms of geography, and how for a land size all of Latin America is compared to the United States. Let's just look at it a little differently.
I totally get that. I think it's a good thing. In fact, oftentimes I have this thing where I'll put the map up like that. I won't have any words on it. I'll say, what are you looking at here?
Right.
And lots of people say, I have no idea.
Yep. So I wanted to also, before kind of jumping into the case studies, take a look at the 2 top markets. This is a lot of information, but just to kind of give you an overview of, there's 300 plus million people in the United States. In Mexico, about 127 million. Brazil, 207 million. GDP in Mexico is about just above $1 trillion US dollars. Brazil, nearly 1.8 trillion rather. GDP growth in 2016 was 2.6%, whereas Brazil a couple of years ago was going through a recession and it shrank by 3.6%. GDP per capita, here's where you can start to see the differences relative to the US, much smaller GDP per capita, over $8,200 US dollars per year, 8,600 in Brazil. The currency in Mexico is the peso. In Brazil, it's the real. Mexico is the 15th largest economy in the world, and Brazil is the 8th. Mexico's 3rd most important trading partner, assuming Canada is number 2, Brazil is number 14. The global 1,000 companies, you have Pemex, which is the national oil company, and América Móvil, which is part of Grupo Carso, which is owned by Carlos Slim, the richest person in the world. And in Brazil, you have Petrobras, the national oil company, Itaú Unibanco, one of the largest banks, Banco de Brazil, and so 3 banks there in the global 1,000. Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the world, with 22 million people, a 5-hour flight from Dulles, Sao Paulo's about 12 million people with takes about 10 hours to get there from Dulles. So why does it make sense to do business with Mexico? We have an agreement with, that's being renegotiated, NAFTA. It's with our government. It's in the central or mountain time zone. Mexicans are very comfortable doing business with the US. A lot of the management and the political leaders of Mexico, were trained in the US. For example, Calderon, went to Harvard for his education, his master's degree, before becoming president in Mexico. Televisa is a very large media company in Mexico that produces telenovelas, but they watch a lot of American movies, listen to a lot of American music, so they're very comfortable with American culture. And of course, NAFTA, even though it's being renegotiated, this has really set the stage for a lot of growth in Mexico. It's interesting when you actually look at the market size, 36 million people, that's the population of Spain, but that's actually the size of Mexico's middle and upper class. And especially in today's conversation in the media, there's a lot of negative talk about Mexico and framing Mexico and Mexicans as being very poor. And that is true that a lot of the Mexican Americans that move here are from the lower classes, the people from the middle and upper class. They have a good life and they choose to stay there. But that market, that middle and upper class in Mexico is the same exact size as the entire country of Spain. Another reason why Mexico is an interesting opportunity for businesses, for you American businesses, is the baby boom in Mexico is happening now. This is data from their census in 2010 from the INEGI. It's their equivalent of the U.S. Census. So this is people, 100 years, 70 to 74 years, 60 to 64, and 0 to 4, 10 to 14, 20 to 24. You can see a majority of the population is actually below, 24 or 30 years of age. So these are people in the prime of their life making decisions about what products and brands to use. GDP growth, especially since NAFTA in the mid-90s, has grown tremendously. And this is, not only makes it a much larger economy to do business in, but a much more stable country as a neighbor. Like many Latin American countries, there were significant problems with inflation, and as you can see here in the 80s through the very early 90s when the peso collapsed. But since that time, inflation has been a lot more stable. So it's, again, another reason why it makes sense to do business there. A lot of American companies do business there, have factories. So here's a little overview of some American companies that do business there. So for PepsiCo, it's their second largest market. In fact, that's where my wife worked before we moved here to Richmond, was PepsiCo Mexico. AT&T bought 2 mobile providers there, merged them, and relaunched the brands. It's their third largest market, they have 15 million subscribers there. Coca-Cola, it's their second largest market. Walmart has very aggressively expanded into Mexico and owns a number of stores, retail brands down there. It's their second largest market, and 20% of their total number of stores are in Mexico. And Citibank, a number of years ago, purchased Banamex, the largest bank in Mexico. So it's their third largest market, and it's the #1 recognized bank brand with over 1,400 retail branches. Another thing I want to talk about here, and obviously with the internet, there's no border on the World Wide Web. I wanted to talk a little bit about the U.S. Hispanic market and why it makes sense to potentially use that as a way to expand into other markets. When you're doing business in the U.S., obviously you don't need to set up a new legal entity. There's no currency issues. So so a little overview about that. There's 51 million US Hispanics in the US. 65% are of Mexican origin, so about 33 million. They have about 1.2 trillion in spending power. And interestingly, remittances to Mexico, or the money sent to Mexico by Mexican Americans back to their relatives, equals about $28 billion. And interestingly, it was the #1 source of revenue for the whole economy for Mexico's GDP that particular year. I think second was Mexico's oil company, Pemex, and then thirdly was tourism. Yep.
You know the percentage of that? What the percentage is?
Percentage of total GDP?
Yeah, well, out of the total GDP, just the remittance back to.
Percentage of total GDP. Let's look that up afterwards. I don't know offhand, but what's happened over the years is that as oil prices have come down in the last 5 years, and as the dollar's strengthened, what's happened is that the value of the remittances in pesos has gone up, and the value of oil, which has historically been the #1 source of revenue for the country, has gone down. So that is one reason for that switch.
Yeah, thank you.
Another important reason why it's important to consider the US Hispanic market is because of growth rate. In about the year 2040, minorities will become the majority in the US, whites will become the minority. And this is not population numbers, but growth rates of different ethnic groups. So the blue here is Native Americans, Alaskan Americans, all double-digit growth rates. You see here 2020, the year 2030, 2040, 2050. Lime green, Asian American, 15%, 16%. African American, high double-digit growth in the purple. And in yellow here, you see Hispanic Americans, majority of which are from Latin America, some from Spain, but 53%, 63%, 79, 85. So in terms of growth, that audience is a significant part of the growth of, and all minorities, whereas non-Hispanic whites, 6.9% growth in 2020, and then you see negative growth in the years after that. Any questions? Comments? No? So now I want to jump into two specific, so I wanted to set the stage in terms of the research about why is it important to consider Latin America. Obviously, these are numbers you want to be looking at when you're sitting in the boardroom or making decisions as management. And now I want to take a look at two or three companies and how they expanded internationally. And I worked with all three of these companies. So the first is Flipboard, and I want to just start out by looking at, this is research by someone named Mary Meeker. She covers internet companies and digital services and products for an investment bank in Silicon Valley, KPCB, Kleiner Perkins. And she has amazing research presentations every year, and this is one from a few years back, looking at what percentage of the top internet brands' traffic and users come from outside of the US. So the gold here are the users in the United States, and the blue are international users. So these are companies that the majority, they're mostly based in Silicon Valley. Google, vast majority of its users, looks like about 80% are from outside of the US. Microsoft in Seattle, maybe about 70%. Facebook also, vast majority. Yahoo, majority. Wikipedia, Amazon, Glam Media. Tencent is obviously from China, so entirely outside of the US. But as you can see, whether you're Tim Cook at Apple or the folks at Microsoft, Google, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, they're really thinking about international. They have to, because that is a majority of their business. So I worked at, I had the opportunity of working at Flipboard. Let me just show you this video. This is what Flipboard looks like. So it's, one of the founders actually came from Apple. He was the designer on the first iPhone. And the idea behind Flipboard was, how do we actually reinvent news for the iPad and smartphones. And so the idea here is how do we bring together all of our news sources that we're interested in, whether it's the Washington Post, New York Times, whatever magazines you like, blogs, and then bring together all those feeds and put them together into one place where you can actually review all of your news sources in one place. So my job was to manage the partnerships for Latin America to help expand the business across the region. This is some information about the top markets. So much like those other companies, a big chunk of our visitors came from the United States, 35%, in places like United Kingdom and China. But we noticed that 7% of our visitors came from the U.S. Hispanic market in Latin America, also Spain, and 4% of our users across the world came from Brazil. But what was especially interesting was that we noticed that the fastest growing markets were those markets, the Latin American, US Hispanic, and Brazilian. They were there was very aggressive growth and a very fast adoption of Flipboard's platform and of all social networks in those regions.
Say a quick, excuse me, word about Flipboard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Flipboard, if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. It's basically an app, you can download it. And then we can populate it with all the magazines or sources that you like. Think about how much time you're flipping through, and here comes an email, or here comes a text. And then basically you spend a lot of time probably every day not reading the things you want, but being taken away by something that appeared from you. In other words, this allows you to take control of the information you're getting.
And to see it all in one place.
All in one place, and it's, it's an enormous resource. It's free.
So we saw that the percentage of the total users, we saw the incredible growth rates, and we said, how can we really better leverage our platform and our relationships to really grow this in the region? So what we did was the initiative I worked on was launching a US Latino content guide, specifically for the US Hispanic market, where we really did a blend of English and Spanish content. So news in Spanish, with sources such as CNN en Español, Huffington Post Voces, newspapers from Mexico like Milenio and Excelsior, and then news in English like the New York Times, Huffington Post Latino Voices, Fox News Latino. And here's a screenshot of what that looks like. So what we did was, anytime that we saw that we had, as a part of the back-end technology, when we detected that someone's phone was set to Spanish, we could automatically direct them to this content guide, and just deliver content that was more relevant to them.
Did you say that again?
So
What?
there are. We developed our technology so that when we could detect someone's settings for language were set to Spanish, we could then deliver this content guide to them, knowing that their preferences on their phone.
Facebook, or did you go through?
No, I mean directly
To the phone.
on their phone. So one of the things that was a part of my job, just to explain that, was that I have my iPhone set to Spanish, and then I test. Yelp, Facebook, and it's interesting. All of the major internet companies do that. They auto-translate based on the settings of your phone. So when you actually, if you want to go ahead and play around with that, and you change, really practice Spanish, you can actually set your language to Spanish. All the settings, all the words, then change to Spanish, and you'll notice that a lot of the apps, like Facebook, like Flipboard, will actually, your experience and the navigation will change in that language, which I think I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. So our key strategy in terms of the marketing of this was not only doing outreach to the press, but specific for the launch of the US Latino Content Guide, but was working with specific influencers. So in this particular case, we wanted to showcase that people could aggregate information, news sources, blogs about what they're passionate about. And we wanted, instead of us talking about ourselves, we wanted Latinos to be actually talking about it to their fans. So we recruited a number of influencers. Ana Flores, she runs a conference in Los Angeles called Latina Bloggers Connect, and she has her own mommy blog, and she has a whole crew of bloggers as a part of her conference and her blogger network. And we knew if we highlighted her story in her Flipboard magazine called Spanglish Life, about raising your kids bilingually, about being a mom, living in Los Angeles, that would better exemplify how to use Flipboard than us talking about it. So we actually brought her front and center as part of the news. In addition, we recruited Chef Pepin. Chef Pepin hasta el fin. He was I think still is on Univision on the morning show talking about recipes and cooking. Again, this is talking about his passion, cooking, him aggregating all of his favorite recipes online in his own Flipboard magazine. In addition, we noticed that there were some VIPs just through our listening and observation of people using Flipboard. This is the former president of Brazil, who's now been incidentally charged with corruption, but we noticed that her and her competitor in Aseo Neves, both of them were actually using Flipboard as a part of their social media during the election to promote their candidacy to become president. So during the election in Brazil and also during the World Cup, we really amped up promoting kind of what we were finding and talking about what was happening in those particular events so as to really maximize conversations on Flipboard. How does Flipboard make money? It's through advertising, and these are two of the advertising campaigns that I sold for Argentina, Brazil, and the US. It was Argentina Tourism, and then IBM Brazil bought advertising on Flipboard in Brazil. And the idea behind it is not to put in a little banner, but to actually have a full-page, beautiful ad that you flip through just like a magazine. So we learned that we observed the dramatic growth of Brazil, of our audience in Brazil, Mexico, and the U.S. Hispanic market through specifically developing a product for them. We also learned that Brazil is a more challenging country to get set up in as a company because there are much higher taxes, especially when you send money out of the country, and there are many more labor and financial requirements because it is essentially a socialist government, and they have a lot of just requirements and commitments for hiring people in their country. In contrast, Mexico's more of a business-friendly environment, accustomed to doing business with Americans. It's easier to set up a company, easier to transfer money to the US. Again, that was set up because of NAFTA. And the US Hispanic market is a great market to really on-ramp to Mexico and the Spanish-speaking Latin America, as we saw with Flipboard by developing that US Latino content guide. Next, I want to talk about a company that's a lot less well-known, AgroAmerica. It's a grower of tropical fruit. I worked with them and was hired by them to develop a bilingual website to optimize the content for search engines, both in English and Spanish. And this is a very business-to-business case study where they really wanted to reach buyers of large grocery chains and improve their search engine. But specifically, it was interesting, they were really noticing a trend of buyers searching for sustainable palm oil, sustainable bananas, plantains. So really they were already using organic methods, but they really wanted to highlight that in their content. So that was part of the strategy.
And was this to attract
US.
American buyers?
Yeah, and the reason why I'm sharing this, even though this is a Guatemalan company trying to reach the US, it's really the same lessons either way you're going. The World Wide Web's a global platform. Whether you're going English into Spanish, Spanish into English, it's really the same kind of digital marketing lessons. Here's their original website in English. As you can see, the toggle for Spanish was over here on the left side. So talking about the company, their fruits, their vegetable oils, mostly palm oils, their transportation services, corporate social responsibility. They have something like 25,000 employees. It's a very large company, so they have to do, a lot of their communications is about how they provide educational services and even housing, I think, for some of their health services for some of their employees, news about the company, the blog, and the contacts. Here's the news site. It doesn't look that different, but a lot of what's going on behind the scenes is actually quite different. First of all, you can see all the social buttons here at the top. Obviously, where do companies get traffic? That is an increasing importance. We also moved the toggle between English and Spanish to the right, which is the more usual place in terms of usability to actually have that placed. So external links from social media. We had a lot of expanded content here in the sustainability channel because we were saying that was a really important in terms of keywords and trying to get into the mindset of the buyers and ultimately consumers in America. That's growing and important. We really emphasized the blog, and any website that has a blog that's updated more often oftentimes gets bumped up in terms of its rankings in Google, and having a better user experience in terms of clearly putting the toggle between English and Spanish on the right side where it usually is. In addition to the navigation, here's an example of that sustainability page. So the original one is here, and the new one is here. And we really wanted to expand that and tell this story better since we knew that was so important for the buyers, to have a deeper, better explained content.
When you made all these changes, did you use like secondary research or primary research to make the changes? And then if you did use primary research, how did you go about it?
Okay, so how did we use primary or secondary research for looking into this? What we did was we utilized it was like Google Analytics on their end to see what kind of keywords, how were people arriving to their site originally, and then using some other Google tools for looking at what's the total potential search volume. So it wasn't primary research maybe in the typical way of doing focus groups and things, but it was based upon their feedback from customers as well as using the digital tools online through Google to really understand what was their current traffic and their potential traffic for these keywords.
And so that informed you as to what, if we do these things, that potential and what we have,
That
we should grow.
here's the potential for growth of both, and it's like a funnel. You want to get, people searching for the products, going to your website, and then ultimately, becoming customers. And that the more that you better position yourself on search engines, the more leads you're getting, and ultimately the more paying customers. What did we learn in this project with AgroAmerica? Well, number one, well-translated content is essential for reaching your target market. Anytime there are grammatical translation errors, it just looks really unprofessional. So we really had to go through the translation with the fine-tooth comb and make sure it's all correct. In addition to the fact of really understanding, in this case, that there's one word for banana used in Mexico versus Central and South America is plátano, which sounds like plantain, but it's what they use for banana. So really also trying to parse through what are the different keywords for their products in which regions and which buyers might use which keyword. Obviously this was part of the research about what keywords our target clients are looking for, sustainability. And we really wanted to emphasize the fact that updating and expanding digital content often is essential, both on the website via a blog, but also social networks. And the bottom line for search engine optimization is really, if it's not optimized, then your website and your whole company is not findable. And that is, obviously becomes an existential crisis because then you don't exist. The last case study I want to talk about here is a company just based up I-95 in Washington, D.C. It's a government agency, Amtrak. Their first adventure into going multilingual and multinational was going into the U.S. Hispanic market, working with a translation company that I worked with, and they approached the translation company to translate their website and their entire e-commerce experience from start to finish into Spanish. So the reason why they did that is because they saw that Hispanics over-index for taking public transportation, and they really wanted to develop that newly translated website to try to reach them and grow their audience.
What does that mean, over-index?
So what that means is that in terms of research, that with 100 being kind of the baseline, if a specific demographic is 110, 120% more likely, or that they're 20% more likely than the average to take trains or buses in this particular case for public transportation.
So this is saying that U.S. Hispanics take public transportation
more often, according to the research that they did at the time. So they thought if we translate into Spanish and we make it easier for them, we'll get more sales. Here's what the Spanish language website looks like today, completely translated from beginning to end in Spanish. A lot of companies cut corners. They might translate a few front-end pages, but then the e-commerce experience is in English. Amtrak didn't do that. They really went the distance and translated the entire website. But what's really interesting was that as soon after they translated the website into Spanish, they saw their website traffic grow. They saw their sales grow. And there were some US Hispanics buying traffic, but interestingly, they started seeing something else. People from Spain traveling to the US to buy tickets when they come to visit New York or Washington, D.C., and they bought tickets in Spanish. So people, these European travelers coming to the US buying tickets on Amtrak.com for their tourism in the US. So they came back to the translation company, Motion Point, and they said, we'd like to do German next. And this particular translation company said, excuse me? Yeah, we see that German is like what we'd like to do next. So from going into a US Hispanic strategy, they stumbled onto the fact that they can also expand internationally. Granted, these are only tickets used in the US, but that international visitors to the US represent a huge opportunity. So from there, the US Hispanic market, people from Spain, tourists from Germany, tourists from France, where train travel is extremely popular, and Mandarin, translating into Chinese for Chinese tourists who want to visit and travel across the United States.
One of the things I've noticed is that in the tourist business, because of the internet, more and more people are doing their own trip planning.
They're doing their own booking.
I could go to this website, which is a travel service, and they could do it for me, but the reality is that if I run the cost of what it costs me to buy them individually versus this group doing it, and it would save me time and whatnot, it's significant.
Absolutely. So
more and more are saying, I'm just going to do this myself.
So it's easier for the users to buy their tickets, and it's better margins for the sellers to offer it directly, which is what you exactly see here. So it was a surprising kind of turn of events by translating their site and how they kind of stumbled in.
What's the real challenge if you're running a travel agency? What do you do?
Very difficult. You have to have really great service at that travel agency. Yeah. So in terms of the lessons learned at Amtrak, we learned that the US Hispanic market can provide a great on-ramp to Spanish-speaking Latin America and Spain. Services are a lot easier to internationalize and sell abroad than physical products, which require shipping and customs. Ultimately, you want to ask yourself, where are your website visitors coming from? This is your next international opportunity to really, with regards to your question for research, really utilizing tools like Google Analytics to understand your website visitors, where they're coming from, how long are they spending, what are they looking for. So in conclusion, Brazil is Latin America's largest market, but has a lot of hurdles for getting set up its business. The higher taxes and more difficult to transfer money back to repatriate money back to the US. Mexico is the US's third largest trading partner, very comfortable doing business with the US, strong growth potential. And I think the easiest is US Hispanic market, an audience here in the US, bilingual, English, Spanish. It's a great testing grounds for expanding into Mexico and Spanish language markets. And as we saw with AgroAmerica, that digital content enables better search engine optimization and results.